How to knit an easy children's cardigan. You can use the same technique to knit an adult-size cardigan. This is an easy-to-follow, beginner-friendly step-by-step tutorial. You can get this pattern on loopymango.com. This video will take you through an entire process step by step. If you have never knitted a cardigan before, this project is for you. We will be using merino number 5 yarn and size 19 15mm knitting needles. So merino number 5 is a super chunky merino wool, and you can find all yarn information on the label. We're going to start with making a slip knot, and for this project I like to make my tail a little bit longer. This way we can use that yarn to seam the panels. So let's make a slip knot, and we start casting on. Refer to your pattern to see how many stitches you need to cast on for the size that you're making. We're just using a backward loop cast on method, but for this project you can use any method. Once you have the right number of stitches cast on, we start working. So we're working bottom up, which means we'll be starting with the bottom of the cardigan, and we are going to do a 1 by 1 rib stitch. So 1 knit, 1 purl. And then we repeat this pattern to the end of the row. We alternate knit and purl stitches. And because we cast on odd number of stitches, we started on a knit, so we should be ending on a knit stitch. We're now at the end of the first row. So purl, and the last stitch is a knit. So you can see the purls and the knits. And then make sure to count so that you still have the same number of stitches that you started with. And our second row, we have to keep doing the rib stitch. So we're going to purl the purls and knit the knits. So the even numbered rows are going to start with a purl stitch. Purl, knit, purl, knit. And so the second row should be ending on a purl stitch. So we're done working the rib. So count the number of rows, and we are now going into a stockinette stitch, which means alternating knit and purl rows. We're starting with a knit row. So this entire row is going to be knit stitches. Odd numbered rows are knit, and even numbered rows are going to be purl rows. So we finished the knit row, and next row is going to be a purl row. So even numbered rows are purl rows. So this is the wrong side. We're facing the wrong side of the garment now. So this is a purl row, which means all stitches in this row are purl stitches. And we keep purling to the end of the row. Okay, we're done with the purl row, so next row is going to be a knit row, and we keep alternating knit and purl rows. And with every row, you can clearly see the pattern. You can see the difference between the right side of the garment and the wrong side of the garment. And then count the rows before you go into the garter stitch section. We have separate videos that show different methods of counting the rows. And from now on, we are going to be doing garter stitch, which means knit every row. So this row is knit. We're facing the right side of the garment. And this is an odd numbered row. And when we flip and we face the wrong side of the garment, we're no longer doing stockinette stitch, we're doing garter stitch. So this row is also going to be a knit row. And this is what creates garter stitch. We're knitting every row. And so you do these knit rows until the end of the back panel of the cardigan. And when you do get to the end of the back panel, do not cast off. So see, you can clearly see the pattern. We just keep working until we get to the end of the back panel. Just keep repeating the knit rows. Okay, we finished working the back panel. Now we're going to split into the two front panels. We're going to use a piece of string as a stitch marker. So we will be only working with enough stitches to create our first panel. Refer to the pattern to see how many stitches you're working with for your size. And we're continuing the garter stitch pattern, but we're only working the number of stitches in the pattern just for that one panel, one front panel. So once you get to the stitch marker, you stop. You don't have to use a stitch marker. You can just count the number of stitches. And then we just keep working back and forth. So we're stopping and we'll be working those panels separately. So let's work the left panel first. We are continuing the garter stitch pattern. So you get to the end of that section and you flip and keep doing knit rows. You can take the stitch marker out after a couple of rows once it becomes really clear where you need to stop. So see that gap keeps getting bigger and bigger, so you know you're not continuing, that you need to stop and go back, and you just keep going back and forth. And when you're done with the garter stitch section, we're going to start working the stockinette section. So the front panel is going to match the back panel. We're now ready to start doing the stockinette stitch. And for stockinette, same thing as you did for the back panel, we're alternating knit rows and purl rows. So this is a purl row, which means the next row is going to be a knit row. And so our odd numbered rows are knit rows and even numbered rows are purl rows. And we keep repeating stockinette pattern until we're ready to do the rib. So we have stockinette, garter, stockinette again, and then we'll end with the rib stitch on the bottom. And then we'll work the second panel. Okay, so we're done with the stockinette section, and this is what our cardigan looks like so far. You can see so far there's no seams because the back panel is going to be seamlessly connected to the front panels. All we have to do to finish this first front panel is to do a few rows of a rib stitch, a 1x1 rib. Since we're working with even number of stitches, we started with a purl stitch, and then when we work the other panel, we'll be starting with a knit stitch just to make these panels symmetrical between each other. So we're doing a 1x1 rib, but we are starting with a purl stitch, and we just alternate P1, K1. So we just finished the first row of rib, and second row, and actually all rows of the rib are going to be the same now. Again, it happens because we're working with even number of stitches. So for the back panel, we were working with odd number of stitches, so that some rows you start with a K1 and others with a P1, but because this is an even number of stitches, then all of your rows are the same. The purl 1, knit 1, and you repeat that for every row. So in a way it's easier. So just refer to your pattern and follow the pattern. And you keep working the 1x1 rib until you're ready to cast off. And we're now ready to cast off. We will be casting off in pattern, which means we're following the same pattern as we were working. So a 1x1 rib pattern, we work 2 stitches, purl 1, knit 1, and now we cast off. So 2 stitches on the needle, cast off. We work the next stitch to get 2 stitches on the right needle and cast off. And you keep adding a stitch and casting off until you get to the end of the row. And we're down to the last stitch. At this point, you can cut the yarn, you can leave a few inches. Take the needle out and put the tail end through the last stitch and secure it. So we just finished working one front panel and we have the second panel to work. And this is what the right and the wrong sides of the garment look like so far. So the left panel is done. We're now going to work the right panel. We're going to use a piece of yarn to hold some stitches for the neckline. So you can use any kind of stitch holder. A piece of waste yarn works quite well. So transfer the stitches and secure them so that they don't slip out. And we're going to have same number of stitches for the second panel as we did for the first front panel. We're going to reattach the yarn. So reattach the yarn. We will be cleaning up all the tail ends at the end of the project. And we keep working the garter stitch the same way as we did for the first front panel. We're doing a few rows of garter stitch, so these are all knit rows. Second panel is easier to do because you're just working all the remaining stitches. And then once we're done with the garter stitch section, we're going to work the stockinette section. We're done with the garter stitch section and we're continuing alternating knit and purl rows for the stockinette section of the second panel. And once we're done with the stockinette section, we're going to do a few rib rows and then the cast off. So we're doing same thing as we did for the first panel. Okay, we're now ready to work the last section here, which is a 1x1 rib. Notice that for the first panel we started with a purl stitch. For the second panel we're going to start with a knit stitch. And this is done just so those ribs are symmetrical. So we have even number of stitches. We started with a knit stitch and we're going to end on a purl stitch, and that purl is to match the purl on the first panel. And because it's an even number of stitches, it's a one row repeat. So for this panel, we start every row with a knit stitch. So it's one knit, one purl. Repeat. And we're now ready to cast off. So casting off the same way, casting off in pattern, we're continuing with the rib pattern. Once we have worked 2 stitches, we cast off. And we keep casting off to the end. And now we're ready to cut the yarn. You can leave a couple inches, secure. And this is what we have so far. So we finished the back panel and the 2 front panels. They're seamlessly connected together, so we don't have any seams so far. We're now going to work the sleeves. The sleeves are going to be knit in the round. So let's find that middle point where the front and the back panel connect. And then you want to kind of start counting down, and you're going to start picking up every other row, so you can kind of count those little bumps. Depending on the size you're making, you want to count down how many stitches you're going to pick up and use a stitch marker. So we'll be picking up equal number from the front panel and from the back panel. We reattach the yarn and we start picking up the stitches. So insert the needle, yarn over knitwise, and we just picked up 1 stitch. And so we keep going and picking up every other row. So basically every bump that you see there signifies 2 rows. So every other row means every bump. And then you just keep going all the way up until you hit the midpoint. The midpoint is where the front panel ends and the back panel begins. We're almost there. We finished picking up stitches along the front panel, and now we're going to pick up stitches along the back panel, and you should have equal number of stitches that you picked up from the front and the same number of stitches of the back panel. And we're now done picking up stitches for the sleeve, and we're going to connect the round. We will be using a magic loop method because the cable here is a little bit too long. If you do happen to have a shorter cable, you can use circular needles with a shorter cable. This way you don't have to use magic loop. Also, we're going to use a stitch marker. This stitch marker is going to designate the beginning of the round. So we're going to start knitting here, and the sleeves are done in stockinette stitch in the round, which means we're going to knit every round. So when you're doing a stockinette knitting flat, you alternate knit and purl rows. But when you're knitting in the round, it's actually much easier. All you have to do is a knit stitch. So we're going to knit every row. And you see how that cable is a little bit too long? So when you get to the point where it kind of becomes uncomfortable or it starts to stick out, you rearrange your stitches. See, you rearrange it like so. And then you just keep knitting. So you're kind of knitting in sections. You knit the stitches that fit, that can easily fit on your left needle. And when you get to the end, you just kind of keep moving them around. And then you see how you have the excess cable kind of sticks out on both sides of your knitting, and it's fine, it just sits there. So this way you're able to use longer needles for shorter circumferences. When you get to that stitch marker, you just move it over, and that's when you know you just started your next round once you get to the stitch marker. Okay, we move the needles, we rearrange again. It takes a bit getting used to if you've never used magic loop before. There are different variations of a magic loop, so this is not maybe a variation that you have seen before, but it really doesn't matter. Magic loop just means that you're using a longer needle for shorter circumference, and you just keep pulling out that excess cable on one side or both sides. Okay, so we're at a point where we're done with the stockinette stitch for the sleeve. And this is what our cardigan looks like so far. And let's count the rows. So we're just counting these strands of yarn. One strand stands for one row, or round rather, since we're knitting in the round. And now we're going to start decreasing for the cuff. So we're knitting 2 stitches together, K2 together. The cuff is more narrow than the sleeve. That is why we're doing a decrease. And depending on what size you're knitting, for some sizes, you keep doing K2 together to the end of the round. And for other sizes, you keep knitting until you have 2 stitches remaining in that round. And then the remaining stitches are just knit, knit. And this is because you need to end up with even number of stitches, because the cuffs are done in a rib, and for the rib knitting in the round you need to have even number of stitches. So for the size we're knitting here in this example, we're knitting until we have 2 stitches remaining. So we're down to last 2 stitches, and instead of doing K2 together, we're just going to knit every stitch. Knit one and then knit the second one. So we're ready for the rib on the cuff. Use a stitch marker, and we are going to do 1 knit, 1 purl. Knit, purl. And we repeat to the end of the round. 1 knit, 1 purl. And you keep going with this rib pattern until you're done with the cuff. And see how the circumference of the cuff is even smaller than the circumference of the sleeve. But not to worry, as long as you use the magic loop method and keep pulling out that excess cable, you can pretty much work with any number of stitches. We're done with the cuff and we can start casting off. We no longer need the stitch marker, so you can remove it. And we will be casting off in pattern. Since we were doing a 1x1 rib, we're going to continue casting off using the 1x1 rib. Knit, purl, and cast off. And keep casting off the same way that you did the cast off for the front panel. The only difference is that we're going in the round now, but the process is exactly the same. And just keep moving those stitches along. So one knit, one purl, cast off. And we're almost at the end of the round. And just one little trick I would like to show you: when you're casting off, when knitting something in the round, such as a sleeve or a hat, you don't want to have that like an even gap there. So when you're down to just that one last stitch, we're going to knit, we're kind of going to get rid of that gap, and we're going to knit one more stitch and then we cast off. So this way everything looks really nice and even. You can cut the yarn and secure the end. And we repeat the same procedure for the second sleeve. And for the second sleeve, you'll just be starting picking up from the back panel instead of the front panel. And we're done. All we have to do now is seam the sides and add the neckline. So the reason we left that tail extra long is so we can use that yarn to do the seaming. For the purposes of demonstration, we're going to use a contrasting color yarn. This way it will be much easier for you to see how seaming works. So first, we connect the panels. So just connect by pulling the yarn through. Okay, and now we start seaming. So you see those bumps on the side? We're going to put the yarn, so we're going to go to the opposite panel. Right now the yarn is coming out from the front. We're going to go to the back and go kind of in and out around that bump and pull the yarn. Don't pull it too tight, not too tight, not too loose. And now we're going to the opposite panel, which is the front panel, but we're doing exactly the same thing. We're going in and out around that bump and pull the yarn. Okay, and we alternate. So we just did the front, now we're going to the back panel, in and out around that little bump. Pull the yarn, and here again, so see, we're going to go around the next bump, but you're basically inserting the needle through the same stitch where the previous stitch was. And we're going back to the back panel. We find the next bump and we go in and out like so, and you pull the yarn. We're doing the front panel now, in, out, pull the yarn. See, even though the yarn is in a contrasting color, you don't even see it. In. So we're in the armhole area. So here, as long as everything looks nice and clean, it doesn't really matter exactly where the yarn goes. You just want to close all the gaps. Any remaining gap that you see, you just want to close it. And when you're done, you pull the yarn on the inside, and this is what your seam looks like on the inside. Okay, and then we do same thing for the other panel. So if you use the same color yarn, you really do not see the seam. This is a great method for seaming sides on any garment. It's very useful. And now we're going to work the neckline. We will be picking up the stitches, so it's a very similar process as what we did for the sleeves. We reattach the yarn. And we start picking up stitches. So for the sleeves, we picked up every other row. Here, the formula is a little bit different. So depending on the size you're making, just do some calculations. As long as everything is equally spaced out, it's not really an exact formula. So basically, what you're doing, sometimes you're picking up every other row, and sometimes you're picking up every row. So look at the total number of stitches that you need to pick up. Subtract the stitches that you put on the stitch holder when you were working the panels. So there's a few stitches there sitting on the stitch marker. So you subtract that number, and the remaining number you divide it by 2. So you want to pick up equal number of stitches from each front panel. And you just keep going and picking them up, and sometimes you pick up every row, sometimes, so for every row, meaning you insert the needle through every bump, but sometimes you want to insert the needle in that strand in between. So you're not doing every row, you're doing sometimes every row, sometimes every other row. And again, as long as it looks nice and even, there's no exact formula here. And if you're off by a couple stitches, it doesn't really matter that much. So we picked up enough stitches for from one panel, and we're now ready to work the stitches that we placed on the stitch marker. If it helps you, you can move them onto a knitting needle, but because there's only a few, I feel that it's easy enough to just work them off of the stitch holder. You just insert the needle through the stitch, yarn over, and that's it. So it's quite easy, and then we work the remaining stitches in exactly the same way. You insert the needle as if to knit, so knitwise, insert the needle, yarn over, and that's it. And we're now going to pick up stitches along the second front panel. So ideally you should pick up the same number of stitches as you picked up off of the first front panel. And sometimes we're inserting every row, sometimes every other row. So through every bump, and sometimes through that strand of yarn that connects, that's kind of in between those bumps. And we keep going this way to the end. And we're almost done picking up the stitches. When you're done, be sure to count them. And this is what our cardigan looks like so far. And we just have a couple rows of a rib for the neckline, and then we can cast off. This is just a 1x1 rib that we've already done for this project, so you should be experts by now. One knit, one purl, and we repeat. Knit, purl. So when you're finished with that first row of rib, you flip and you start working the second row. So second row, we start with a purl because we're knitting the knits and purling the purls. And it's exactly same thing, but we're just going in the opposite direction. And you keep repeating 1x1 rib to the end of the row. And we're now ready to cast off. We'll be casting off in pattern. So this was a 1 by 1 rib, which means we're going to do 1 by 1 rib and cast off. So 1 knit, 1 purl, cast off. So same type of cast off that we did for the front panels. Just keep adding a stitch and cast off. And keep going to the end. And we're almost done casting off. We're now ready to cut the yarn. Leave a few inches and secure the tail end. And we're done knitting. All we have to do now is clean up and weave in the ends. And this is what the cardigan looks like, the finished garment. And you see there's only 2 seams, just those seams on the sides, and everything else is done seamlessly. So all of those tail ends need to be cleaned up. So basically what we're doing, we're just hiding those ends in between the stitches on the inside of the garment. There's a great tool that you can use, and it's felting needle. It's very useful for weaving in the ends. If you don't have it, it's fine. This is how you weave in the ends. So you can easily just do it by hand. You can use a large tapestry needle, but because this yarn is chunky, doing it by hand is quite easy and fast. And this is what the felting needle looks like. It's a felting needle tool, and for this yarn we're using 2 needles. You can unscrew it and take out the extra needles. It comes with 3 by default, but you can use as many as you need to. You can use 1, 2, or 3. For merino number 5, 2 needles work best. And just be careful because the needles are quite sharp. So until you get the hang of it, go very slow. And the way it works is that those needles have small incisions on them, and they catch the fibers of merino wool, and they kind of intertwine them together. Also, another reason why you want to go slow and be gentle, because you don't want to break the needle, because it's quite thin and sharp. So go slow, don't poke yourself, and also don't break the needle. And this is what our final cardigan looks like. Everything has been cleaned up, Everything looks nice and neat. And we're done. Congratulations. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and we have a lot more video tutorials for you on Loopy Mango YouTube channel.